Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danny Plugger, and I am the Executive Director of the Virginia Transit Association. I want to welcome everybody to the first 2024 VTA and DRPT Joint Lunch and Learn webinar program. VTA is so thankful for this partnership and the opportunity to offer our members in the Commonwealth transit community a deeper dive into the public transportation's challenges, issues, and processes with insight from the experts at DRPT. This webinar series would not be possible without the support, partnership, and expertise of DRPT, and today's program is going over Virginia's legislative process, or as I like to say, how to turn your transit-related bill into transit-related law. And for context, there was nearly 3,000 pieces of legislation that were introduced during this 60-day legislative session, and nearly 1,000 of them have made their way to the governor's desk for his action, including HB 285, the amazing Better Bus Stop bill, which will help replace signs and ditches with shelters and benches. So stay tuned for more on that at next month's Lunch and Learn program. And as a reminder, our former programs are on VTA's YouTube page. So if you'd like to go back and review them, you may do so. And as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, please keep them or put them in the Q&A box, and I will ask them at the appropriate time. One final piece of housekeeping: registration is now open for our 2024 conference and expo in beautiful Harrisonburg in late May. So please visit our website, vatransit.com, for more information. Now, this afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenter, Evan Price. Evan is a policy specialist at DRPT. He was previously with the State Council for Higher Education for Virginia and the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee staff, working on higher education, transportation, and demographic trends. Evan is originally from Charlottesville and is a graduate of George Mason University's School of Government. He studied government and policy analysis with a minor in data analysis and rode for the crew team. Outside of work, Evan enjoys biking, hiking, rowing on the James, watching soccer, baseball, and tennis, and playing music. So please grab your lunch, sit back, and enjoy a great program for Evan. Kicking it over to you, Evan.
All right, thanks, Danny. And good afternoon, everybody. Glad everyone could be here today. As Danny said, my name is Evan Price. I'm with the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. I am a policy specialist with the agency, and one of the areas that I'm really focused on is the legislation on transportation. My experience with the Senate Finance Committee gave me a really good insight into how the legislative process works. So today, my goal is to share that entire process and the knowledge that I learned with you all. So moving right into it. Oh, Danny, do you have control over the slides? It seems I'm not moving here. Is that on my end?
I do not.
There we go. Oh. Okay. Minor technical difficulties. All right. So here's what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to start with just an overview of the General Assembly. This is civics, your high school civics class, the basics. Talk about the leadership. These are the people that you need to know first and foremost, the ones that the big decision makers, the ones who run the committees and move the parties along. I'll then cover how you get your bill or your idea into a bill, and eventually how that bill becomes law. I'll also talk about a few things that the General Assembly makes the General Assembly pretty unique. You know, it traces its history to be over 400 years old. So there's a lot of old traditions and things that we do that are very different than any other state that can be pretty surprising and sometimes pretty comedic. I'll then talk about the budget process, and the budget process is the most important process of them all. And the budget in Virginia reigns supreme. If the budget says something, even if it conflicts with the Code of Virginia or a bill that was just passed, the budget supersedes it. It is the holy document, the holy grail in government. And I will go further into that and talk about Virginia's funding for public transit, which will incorporate how the budget works into that, as well as how federal funding plays into public transit. So moving right along, just a quick overview of the General Assembly. Again, this is your high school civics class, bicameral legislature. The lower house is the House of Delegates. There's 100 members. 40 senators in the upper house. Delegates serve 2-year terms. Senators serve 4-year terms. Session occurs annually on the second Wednesday of January every single year. This year, that was January 10th, I believe. Even number of years, that means session is supposed to last for 60 days because of the budget. That is when the budget is adopted, so they have a longer session. Officially, in the odd-numbered years, the session will be 30 calendar days, but every single year for the past at least a decade, the General Assembly has extended their short session to be 45 days, just because the volume of bills has continued to increase over the years. Parties select their own internal leadership as part of their caucus. That's not an open vote for who the leadership is. It's of the elected officials. And leadership positions have varying responsibilities, from running the day-to-day operations of the floor to just chairing committees or being the whips who just make sure the party stays organized and votes together. And both the Senate and the House have committees. The leadership of Democrats and the Republicans the leadership of the House and the Senate appoint the leadership to each committee. There are 14 standing House committees and 11 standing Senate committees. There can be temporary subcommittees called or joint subcommittees. There are several standing joint subcommittees. I'm not going to get into those, but be aware that these are the only permanent committees, and there are additional committees that can be formed when necessary. So, typical General Assembly calendar. It's pretty routine, the General Assembly. There are things that can change every now and then, but for the most part, it is spelled out in the Code of Virginia, the calendar and the order of the General Assembly. So the first big date in the General Assembly process is when the governor proposes or presents his budget. This year last year was December 20th. He'll propose either his initial budget for the whole biennium, or in preparation for an odd-numbered year, he'll propose an amended budget. That is before what is called the Joint Money Committees, which is the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, and the House Appropriations Committee and the House Finance Committee, which are two separate committees. That's a very big event. It is a preview of what is going to be the big topics for each session. As I said before, the second Wednesday of each year will be the first day of General Assembly. And that is the last day to pre-file a bill. Pre-filing is just getting your bill in advance to the agency that is responsible for drafting this legislation. But an important date after the second Wednesday of each year. There's a lot of dates to keep track of, but bear with me. The first Friday of each session is when budget amendments are due. Budget amendments are when the members, the delegates, and the senators propose their changes to the budget. These are very important if you have a bill, for example, that has a fiscal impact. Say it dedicates $10 million to building bus shelters in Virginia. If you don't include an amendment to the budget for that money, that bill is empty. It's not effective. It's either an unfunded mandate or it's just unenforceable because there's no money behind it. Again, the budget reigns supreme. So the budget amendment date, very important. After the end of the second week of session is the bill filing deadline. You cannot file bills after that, and most bills will have dropped before that. The only exceptions for emergency bills, which does require the consent of the General Assembly to be filed as an emergency bill. Roughly the halfway point of session, it's actually a little after the 50% mark, is crossover. Crossover is when all the bills that were introduced to the House or all the bills introduced to the Senate cross over into their chamber. This is important because both chambers need to review every single bill, and the money committees at the same time need to present their budget documents slightly afterwards. This is Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee and the House Appropriations Committee presenting what they have accepted and put into the budget to be reviewed by their own chamber. If an amendment hasn't made it into the budget or a bill hasn't crossed over to the other house by this point, the other chamber, by this point, those legislation are effectively dead. The last week of session, which is usually in shorter sessions in late February, this year it was first week of March, is the last week for committees. All bills need to be out of committee voted onto the floor by this point. And this is when what's so-called a conference begins. Conferees are appointed to bills that are different in either chamber, and they need to bring these bills together to be one unified, identical piece of legislation. Last week of session, all bills must be passed by adjournment and then signed by the leadership of the House and the Senate. Late February, early March, scheduled end of General Assembly. You'll see this term that I always struggle to pronounce. It's either sine die or sine die or shine die. It depends on who you ask, but that means the official end of General Assembly. I think it literally translates to without a schedule or without intent to return. That just means the General Assembly is done. They're not reviewing anything else until they're called back into session. 1 calendar month after session ends is when the governor has his action deadline. This year, that'll be April 8th. That is when the governor either has to sign, amend, or veto every single bill. And then 6 weeks after session ends, or 2 weeks after that, is what is known as a veto session. That's the one-day session that's coming up soon, where the General Assembly returns to act on the governor's changes. So I'm not going to read through all this leadership because it's a lot of names, a lot of people to keep track of. But the House and the Senate, they have two very different leadership structures. In the House, the majority party elects the speaker, and he's the one responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the floor. He calls on speakers. He makes sure people stay in order and that what they're saying is germane to the law and the procedure of the House. And of course, the speaker is Delegate Don Scott from Portsmouth, as he would say. So he is the effective leader of the House of Delegates. I'm not going to read through everybody else, but the people most important to transportation in the House are Delegate Carrie Delaney, who is the chair of the Transportation Committee, and the Appropriations Committee chair. And the House Appropriations Committee is one of those money committees. Any bill with a fiscal impact has to go before his committee. So if you introduce a piece of legislation that will somehow change the budget, create new revenue, require a hiring of new positions from the state budget, which will have a fiscal impact, it has to go to the Appropriations Committee, and Delegate Luke Torian from Prince William is the chair of that committee. On the Senate side of things, the head of the Senate is the is the Lieutenant Governor, who wears two hats as the President of the Senate. That is, of course, Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears. She runs the same things the same way as the House Speaker. Calls on speakers, make sure people stay in line, keeps things in order, keeps things moving. But she also has the ability to cast a tie-breaking vote on anything except for the budget, I believe. The two committees that chairs that are most important to the transportation, again, Transportation Committee chair in the Senate is Jennifer Boysko from Fairfax, and then the Finance and Appropriations Committee chair is Louise Lucas, also from Portsmouth. So now to going through the process of how you create a bill, or how your bill goes from idea to eventually into the Code of Virginia, and the entire legislative process. I'm not going to read all the text on this slide. It is very technical, in-depth process for creating legislation. If you want to read the actual slides and get a little more information, feel free to. The only way to really know, like every single process you need to know, there are rules on the General Assembly website that will tell you everything a bill needs to do. But I'm just going to give a high-level summary of what happens. So bills need to start out as an idea. Delegates and senators are the ones who can submit a bill, but a lot of their ideas come from their constituents, from government agency that they're in contact with, or an organization or a lobbyist. So this usually happens in the summer or fall before session begins, where these people will bring these ideas to the senators or the delegates, and the delegate or senator, if they decide and agree to carry legislation, they are not obligated to, and most legislative ideas they won't bring, will bring the draft idea to the General Assembly's team of lawyers, which is the Division of Legislative Services, and they're the people who are responsible for drafting the actual bill. If you have something that you want to become a bill, the best way to start is many, many, many months before session begins. Get in contact early, reaching out to a member, clearly explaining the bill, what it changes, what it does, why it's important to you. letting them know that you're a constituent is the best way to begin that process. But even then, there's no guarantee that it will become a bill due to various constraints, political beliefs, or bill limits. So, like I said, the Division of Legislative Services is the agency responsible for drafting legislation. Bill needs to be introduced before the bill deadline. It's usually better to get it in early before the pre-filing deadline, gives it more time to be drafted correctly. And then once a bill is introduced, either by the House or Senate clerk, the bill will be sent to the appropriate committee. Speaker of the House, excuse me, is one who sends the bill to the appropriate committee. The clerk of the Senate does the same. Certain committees may also request a bill. This happens frequently if there's a bill with a financial impact. The money committees will say, we would like to see this bill come for our committee. Once assigned to a committee, the chair of that committee will send it to an appropriate subcommittee where the bill will actually be heard in greater detail, the recommendations made, reviews by lawyers and staff, and this is when a lot of people will speak to the bill. It is important to note that a subcommittee cannot kill a bill. It has to go before the full committee before any action can be taken on it. So while in subcommittee and in committee, people will speak to the bill, speak against the bill, and there will be changes and recommendations made in subcommittee that'll go before the full committee. Once a bill is in full committee, there's a lot of things that can happen. If everyone is okay with the bill, a committee will usually just report the bill out without any changes and say the committee recommends approval, committee recommends reporting unanimously, and it's onto the floor. But oftentimes there's a lot of changes. There will be amendments and substitutes, which are changes to the actual text of the bill that the committee can either vote to incorporate or reject. Or a committee can do several actions that effectively kill a bill for a session. They can just vote to outright kill a bill, which often does not happen explicitly because it's considered rather rude to just straight out kill a bill. There are nicer ways to kill a bill, which includes passing a bill by indefinitely, which means we'll listen to it later, which usually means never. There's continuing to the next session, which can only happen from an even year to the odd number year of session. If a bill is not heard that next year, it dies, or they can just not hear a bill at all. This notably happened this session where this bill introducing the authority to create an arena in Northern Virginia was never heard by any committee on the Senate side of things. That killed that bill. It was never talked about, but that's one way to kill a bill. And there are other actions people can take on a bill. They can incorporate one bill into another if they're similar, or a delegate or a senator can ask for their bill to be completely withdrawn. So once a bill is on the floor, it's a long process still, even after through the committee. A bill officially needs to be read on 3 separate days. If you take that literally, that does mean that the clerk of the House or the Senate needs to read the entire text of the bill. Fortunately for everyone, that is always waived. That never happens. Once a bill is on first reading, that means this is what it is reported at a committee. This is for public comment. People can look into it. The bill will then be moved into the second reading on the next day. And once it is on the second reading, it is in this position called the amenable state, or the amenable state. The amenable state is the point where bills can be changed by the floor. This is where the amendments and the substitutes recommended by a committee are finalized and put on top of a bill, or where people on the floor will suggest changes on that floor and they will be adopted or rejected. The bill cannot be killed at this point, but it is the last chance to make changes to a bill unless it gets re-referred to another committee. And then finally, bills are engrossed, which means they're printed as final and moved on to their third reading. So after 3 days of saying, moving this bill on to second reading, moving this bill on to third reading, and on the third day, you finally get to actually vote on a bill. So it is a long process. It takes several days. And on third reading, bills that have unanimous support from everyone, both Democrats and Republicans, are usually passed in a block, while regular bills that have opposition from one party or another or a certain section of a party will be voted on individually, one by one. All bills must also be read and passed before crossover, that halfway point of the session that I mentioned earlier. or they will just effectively be killed. Now, crossover, things get really complicated at this point. Bill needs to be communicated from one house to another. If a communicated bill does not make it to this point, again, they're dead. But once a bill goes from, say, the Senate to the House, it needs to start the entire process all over again. Go from subcommittee to committee to first, second, third reading and onto the floor. And changes will be made. These bills will not pass from the House and Senate identically. And that usually makes it pretty complicated. So what often will happen if a bill is passed, the Senate and the House will have two different versions of the same bill. And that is when a committee of conference is going to have to be called to make one bill the same, because according to the rules of the General Assembly, a bill must be in the exact same form for it to go before the governor and be signed. This is even small grammatical errors. If there are slight differences, a punctuation point is different, a bill will fail unless it is exactly identical. So if a bill exists in different forms in each chamber, a committee of conference will need to be formed and create one unified bill. If the bill cannot be passed in identical form, it's going to die. It will not be signed by the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, and will not be communicated to the governor. So conference, I've said this a few times. What is conference? Conference is that so-called smoke-filled room, the one that you don't see what's happening, where the sausage is really made. A committee of conference is a group of delegates and senators who are appointed to a certain bill to hash out the differences between each chamber's version. No one knows what's happening in a committee of conference. They're not open to the public. You cannot go to them. You cannot speak to them. You don't know where they are or when they are. They are private, and who knows what's actually happening? I have no idea. Even having worked with these senators, I don't know what goes on back there. What these committees of conference do is they come to an agreement between Democrats, Republicans, opposition, and supporters of the bill, et cetera, and create either one bill that everyone can agree on and that both the House and Senate will vote yes on, or they'll just say, sorry, we can't agree to this. We're just going to let this die in conference. Frequently, when a bill comes out of conference, the party whips will say, you need to vote for this to get it passed. There can still be opposition, of course, but generally the majority party will support a conference bill in its identical form and pass it out of the House and Senate identically and send it to the governor. Once a bill has been sent out of the House and Senate, signed by the Speaker of the House and then the President of the Senate, the bill will go to the governor. Of course, the governor has several actions that he can take. He can veto a bill, he can sign a bill, he can return the bill with amendments, or do nothing. If the governor chooses not to act on a bill, it will become law after a certain period of time, after the governor's action deadline. Now, another important session is the veto session. I mentioned this earlier. This happens about 6 weeks after the General Assembly adjourns. This is usually a one-day session where the General Assembly will act on vetoes or amendments. The General Assembly has to can overrule an amendment with a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers. That's the same how it is in Congress. In amendments, the General Assembly does not need a 2/3 majority to overrule an amendment. They can either, by simple majority, vote to adopt or vote to reject an amendment. Once a bill has, if the General Assembly has accepted a governor's amendment, then it is signed by the governor, it is good to go. If they reject an amendment, they send that back to the governor again to be reviewed. And if the governor again vetoes that bill, that's final. You cannot overturn a second veto. So that's a lot. It's complicated. It is one hell of a process, but there are also a few other things that are pretty important to know so that you don't get surprised if you're watching session. So first, ties are complicated. In the House, a tie means a bill dies automatically. There is no tie-breaking vote. Speaker of the House is a delegate and a member of the party. But in the Senate, the president of the Senate is the lieutenant governor. They're elected separately. They're not a senator. So Lieutenant Governor Sears, has a tie-breaking vote in certain situations. Not in the budget, and not every bill is a tie on a 2020 vote. There are some bills that cannot pass by simple majority. such as bills that have taxing authority or bills with emergency provisions, they need a greater than a simple majority to pass. The exact amount, I cannot remember off the top of my head because it's super complicated. Oftentimes the members don't know themselves. But bills like these, there's no tie-breaking vote for that. Either you pass that threshold or it fails. One fun quirk to look out for is the House and Senate have pages. These are middle schoolers. They're in basically in a mini private school for during the session. They're all, you see them running around the floor. They're running errands for the senators and delegates, but they're also taking classes and learning things. They're learning legislation and leadership and etiquette during their time. And notably, they often pull pranks on the delegates and senators. So if you look on the floor, you might be able to see one of the senators commenting on the prank that this page has pulled on them today. There's also something very important to note is that there are conflict of interest laws for the General Assembly. If a senator or a delegate is employed in a sector or is involved in a trial that is related to a bill, they have to vote to abstain. In the Senate, that is called Rule 36, and the House is called Rule 69, meaning I have conflict of interest, I'm not voting on this bill. And finally, the Virginia Public Access Project, our good friends down the street on Main Street, they put a blooper reel together at the end of every session, which is a great way to learn that the Senate and the House, they make quite a few mistakes, even though they are the experts. Now, the budget. So this is a pretty complicated process itself. So I'm going to move through it pretty quickly and give a high-level overview. But the budget is the most important thing in the General Assembly in the state government of Virginia. The budget overrules everything. So the budget process is year-round. It starts in late summer when agencies such as DRPT will submit proposals to the Department of Planning and Budget, which are then reviewed by the governor and the cabinet. And then in December, those proposals, along with the governor's priorities, will be introduced in the proposed budget. And then, as I said, the session happens. Budget bills are referred to the money committees. They're amended. They're changed. They're put into conference. They're voted on constantly. It's a lot of discussion. And then finally, hopefully, the House and the Senate can come to an agreement on one unified budget, which will then go to the governor and then signed, fingers crossed, signed. And then late spring, the General Assembly will act on any amendments and pass the final budget, which will begin on July 1st. In Virginia, we have a biennial budget, so it's one budget for 2-year periods, but which begins on July 1st of an even-numbered year and ends on June 30th of the next even-numbered year. But every session, including the odd session, the in-between session, will come back and amend each budget as revenue changes, priorities change, etc. Like I said, Virginia has a biennial budget. We also have some very strict rules about the budget. The budget must be balanced. Unlike the federal government that is allowed to spend more money than they have, Virginia is absolutely not allowed to do that. That is unconstitutional, and a budget that spends more money than Virginia has is not allowed to be passed. It's an illegal bill if it's spending more money than Virginia has. So if revenues are down, Virginia has to adjust accordingly. And like I've alluded to multiple times, the Virginia budget overrides the Code of Virginia. Even if code expressly contradicts what the budget says, the budget takes precedent. So if the Code of Virginia says you can't drive a bus more than 35 miles per hour on a Sunday, but the budget says, actually, yes, you can do that, the budget reigns supreme. The only problem with that, of course, is that the budget is only a 2-year-long bill. So anything that is conflicting with code, it expires after the budget goes out of effect. And of course, bills with a financial impact, any bill with a financial impact has to go to these money committees. And if a bill requires money to go alongside it to support its endeavor, where it's like, if it was to say, provide money to support WMATA, if there's a bill that says we're supporting WMATA, but there's no money included with it, that bill is effectively killed. So important things to know. An additional thing to note is very little of Virginia's budget is negotiated. Nearly 2/3 of Virginia budget is non-general funds, which are often fees, grants, or other funds that are earmarked, distributed for a specific purpose, often driven by formula. the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, which supports DRPT and public transit, is one of those non-general funds. It's not something that is negotiated. It's driven by formula. And generally, general funds, which is a mix of personal income tax, state sales tax, and the corporate tax, make up where the most of the legislation occurs. Most of this happens at the margin. The very small changes. Most things were just built off of what the budget included last year. And most of it is already set aside, and very only small amounts of small dollar amounts are negotiated in each session. So moving on to the transportation funding in Virginia. So after a major legislative change in 2020, the Commonwealth Transportation Fund became the main pool for all transit funds, from VDOT, the DMV, to the spaceport out on the Eastern Shore, and DRPT, our Front of the Passenger Rail Authority, all of which are pooled into the same fund. So all of these taxes and fees are brought into this one pool, where it is then driven through formula to determine each agency's budget. So off the top, a few $1 million are taken off the top for various specific projects, and then for us, relevant for DRPT and the transit agencies, 49% is brought to the Transportation Trust Fund, and then from that, 23% goes to the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, which that is DRPT's budget, and that is DRPT's fund. Transportation Trust Fund is then where the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund has several distributions within itself. The Rail Fund and the Mass Transit Fund are the two that DRPT administers. The majority of the Rail Fund goes to Passenger Rail Authority. The majority of the overall Transportation Trust Fund goes for VDOT for construction programs. I'm sorry, I'm throwing around a lot of terms right here. It's very complicated. Just bear with me. We'll get to the most important parts. But the Transportation Trust Fund supports the other transportation agencies, including the DMV, the Department of Aviation, the spaceport on the Eastern Shore. That 23% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, this is what supports public transit in the Commonwealth. So this is DRPT's budget. This is what we pass through each year to transportation providers. This is where you get your operating capital grants, where you get TRIP, and where WMATA gets its state support. So, and DRPT also gets our agency operating budget. We are allowed to keep up to 5% of funds for administration. I believe the last I heard, we are below 2%. It's part of our goal to be good stewards of public resources. We don't want to have a very large administrative budget. That's more, the lower our administrative budget, the more money there is available for our transit providers. And as determined by code, the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund is distributed by formula as follows. So 46%, the largest amount, goes to WMATA for Virginia's state match, and then the transit operating and transit capital, the next two biggest pools of money, either the merit operating and the merit capital programs, where transit agencies will apply and receive funds. And then additional programs that we have are Transit Ridership Incentive Program, which receives 6% of our budget. This is for regional connectivity, zero reduced fare projects, passenger amenities, and public safety programs for public transit providers. And then up to 3.5% of our budget goes to VRE, which is commuter rail that serves the I-66 and I-95 corridors. And then we reserve 2.5% of our budget for special programs. There are also a few other areas that are taken off the top of our budget. We have the $50 million each year goes to the, am I going to get this abbreviation right? The Passenger Rail Investment
and Improvement Act.
Okay, I got it right?
Yeah, good job.
All right. So $50 million off the top for that. That goes to WMATA, to our share that we use to match what the federal government provides for WMATA. And then $2 million for our state safety and oversight program. This is ensuring that public transit, specifically rail transit, is safe. And we reserve $1.5 million for paratransit, which is our human service providers. There are also, of course, federal funds. I'm not going to go through the list of these. I'm not an expert on these. I would reach out to someone on our transit team if you want to learn more about these programs. But these 53 somethings are dedicated federal funding for various transit reasons. Some of which are determined by formula based off of need. As others are specific dedicated amounts of money for like safety and oversight, and others are grant programs. But this is how the federal government provides support for public transportation. And I think, yeah, I know that was a lot to go over, but that is as high level as you can get with public transportation in Virginia. It gets even more complicated than that with legislative process. But I hope this was helpful. And of course, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Evan, I have the first question, which is,
All right.
Do budget amendments need to have a fiscal impact to be in the budget?
That is a good question. And the answer is no. A budget amendment can sometimes just be what is called language only, which just means that included in the budget is a little blurb saying something must happen, something shall not happen, et cetera, even then there will be no dollars attached to it. This happens pretty frequently. The most recent example I can think of is our agency, DRPT, was tasked to do a study on rail-centric economic development in the Lynchburg area from a budget amendment that had no money attached to it, no fiscal impact. It didn't change our budget or provide any funding for us in any way, but it said, agency, you need to do this study. So this happens pretty frequently.
Yeah, and it's another way for the legislators to kind of get things included without having to go through a bill that goes through multiple chambers when it's a sentence added here or there.
Yep.
Another question, if you want to go back to the kind of timeline, is where does the CTB kind of fit into that schedule? Because they also have to take action. I think it's a little bit further, not the General Assembly calendar, but there was another calendar, I think a few slides towards the end, that kind of marked the process of, yeah.
All right.
Does the CDB kind of fit into that?
So this is something I'm still learning about, but in short, the CTB is a year-round operation. The CTB approves what is known as the 6-year improvement plan, which is the Transportation Secretariat's financial plan for 6 years. The good thing about transportation is because we are a secretariat driven by funding formulas, we can plan our budget out 6 years in advance. So what will happen for us is that in April, we will bring before the board, we're currently in this process of developing this right now. We'll bring before the board a draft 6-year improvement program, which will include what funding we're getting over the course of the next upcoming fiscal year, who it's going to, what grants, what operating support we're awarding. The only thing, where this fits into the whole budget process is that it has to be with funding approved by the General Assembly. The General Assembly's budget usually just includes what the Commonwealth Transportation Board has accepted as the projections for funds. And then we use what the General Assembly incorporates from that projection into our 6-year improvement program. So it's a bit of a cyclical cycle. It's a bit of a cycle. But Commonwealth Transportation Board makes these, adopts the actual final specific budgets, whereas the General Assembly passes a higher level budget that just confirms how much money the Transportation Board is allocating to various programs. So let me know if that answers your question. It's hard to wrap your head around, and it's an ongoing, constant process. It's never really ending.
Yeah. And the CTB, to kind of build off of what Evan was talking about, the CTB can't take action on a budget, especially a new budget like the one that is being discussed now between the governor and the General Assembly. They can't take action on their FY25 budget until the General Assembly and the governor have their formal FY25 budget. If there's changes to the biennial budget, they can operate under previous assumptions. But with a new budget, the CTB, so if you have projects in the 6-year plan, they are kind of up in the air until the General Assembly and governor come to an agreement and sign a budget, and then the Commonwealth Transportation Board can then use those General Assembly, the state's budget, to base their own assumptions and then take action on the 6-year plan. So keep an eye out because everything is a waterfall, and what happens on one end flows down and impacts everybody else. And I know a lot of our transit agencies await kind of what the CDB does as well. Any other questions for Evan? Okay. Well, thank you again, Evan, on behalf of VTA and our members for giving us this update and insight. We appreciate it. This will be on YouTube, and thank you again for everybody for joining us today for the first Lunch and Learn session for 2024. We look forward to these programs, and I hope everybody enjoys a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.